It was the summer of 2010 when Emily and her boyfriend Dave decided to go on a road trip. They were both from the city, and the idea of escaping to the mountains for a weekend seemed like the perfect getaway. They packed the car, loaded up with snacks, and set off early on a Friday morning, eager to get to the cabin they had rented in the remote woods. The drive started off easy. Smooth highways and open roads stretching out before them. Emily and Dave chatted and listened to music, the kind of easy banter that comes with being young and in love. But as they neared the cabin's location, the roads began to narrow, the familiar buzz of city life fading into the hum of their tires on a much quieter, isolated path. "Are you sure this is the right turn?" Emily asked, squinting out the window at the unfamiliar landscape. "Yeah," Dave replied, looking down at the directions on his phone. "It says we're close, just another 10 minutes or so." The road was starting to look more and more like a dirt trail, trees crowding in on both sides, their thick canopies casting long, shifting shadows on the ground. The GPS had started to falter in the rural stretch, losing signal every now and then, but Dave was confident they were on the right track. Then the turn came, an old dirt road barely wide enough for the car to squeeze through. There was no sign marking it, but the directions clearly said to take a left here. "I don't know." Emily hesitated, looking at the dense woods beyond. "This doesn't seem right." "We'll be fine," Dave reassured her with a smile, eager to get to the cabin. "It's just a dirt road. The cabin's right up ahead." They drove down the road for a few minutes, but the further they went, the more uncomfortable Emily began to feel. The trees were so thick here that there was no light, just an eerie twilight. The air was unnaturally still, no sounds of animals or birds, just a deep, unnatural silence. "Maybe we should have turned back," Emily said, gripping the door handle. "This place feels off." Dave shook his head. "We're almost there. Let's just keep going." The road seemed to stretch on forever. After what felt like hours, Emily's nerves began to get the best of her. She glanced at Dave, but his eyes were fixed ahead, his jaw tight with concentration. There was no turning back now. Eventually, they came to a fork in the road. The path diverged into two narrow trails, one slightly more worn than the other. Emily squinted, but there was nothing to indicate which path they should take. "I think we should go back," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We're close," Dave said again, more firmly this time, his impatience rising. "I'll check my phone." But when he pulled out his phone, the screen flickered and went black. "Great," he muttered, tapping the screen. "No signal." Emily felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, but Dave wasn't listening. "Look, I'll take the right fork," he decided, pointing to the path with the wider tire marks. "It looks like the main road." They continued down the right path for another 20 minutes, the road growing even more remote, less traveled. The trees seemed to close in tighter around them. The further they went, the more Emily's unease grew. She began to feel like they were being watched, like something in the woods was aware of their presence. She turned around and saw nothing but the winding trail they had just come from. "Dave," she said, her voice low, "I really don't like this. We should turn back." Dave, however, was too caught up in the excitement of finding the cabin. "Just a little longer," he said, almost absently. "It's not far now. I can feel it." Suddenly, the car lurched, the wheels spinning in the thick mud. Emily gasped, looking down to see the tires buried halfway in the muck. Dave slammed his hand against the wheel. "Damn it!" he cursed, trying to reverse, but the car only slid deeper. They were stuck. "Great," Emily muttered, staring out the window at the thick forest around them. "Now what?" Dave tried the engine again, but there was no use. "I'll try to find help," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Stay here, okay?" "Are you sure that's a good idea? This place is—" But Dave was already out of the car, heading down the road. Emily watched him disappear into the trees, her stomach sinking. She sat in the car, feeling the oppressive silence closing in around her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. She kept checking the time, but there was no sign of Dave. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was now a labyrinth of shadows. "Dave," she called out, opening the door slightly. There was no answer. Her heart was pounding now, and she had the overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, she decided to get out of the car. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal, just a blank screen. She had no idea where she was, and now she was alone. The woods around her were unnervingly quiet. No sounds, no wind, not even the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. Just the eerie silence. Emily walked a little further down the path, her breath shallow, her senses heightened. And then she saw it. A figure. In the distance, standing motionless at the edge of the trees, was a man. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat, and his clothes were dark, blending into the shadows. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched her. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. She felt like her feet were glued to the ground. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to cooperate. Then the man took a step toward her, his movement slow and deliberate. Emily bolted, her heart pounding in her chest as she sprinted back toward the car. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she was sure she could hear footsteps behind her. She made it to the car, slamming the door behind her. She locked it, her hands shaking. A few minutes later, she saw Dave emerge from the trees, his face pale and sweating. "Emily!" he called out, running toward the car. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking with relief. Dave was breathing heavily, his eyes wide. "I don't know. There's no one out there. I got turned around, but I saw something." "What do you mean?" Emily asked. Dave hesitated, glancing nervously into the dark woods. There was something watching me, too. They didn't stay another minute. They pulled the car out of the mud with great effort, and without looking back, they sped down the path, turning around at the first opportunity. The road twisted and turned, but the man, the strange figure, never followed. They drove straight back to the main road, not stopping until they reached a gas station, far from where they had gotten lost. They never spoke about what happened that night. The road, the woods, the figure. They never returned to that part of the mountains. But sometimes, Emily still wakes up in the middle of the night. The image of that man's cold stare burned into her mind, wondering if he was ever really just a man at all. In 2003, Sarah and her two best friends, Megan and Josh, rented an old 3-story house for their senior year of college. The rent was suspiciously cheap, but they didn't question it. The place was huge, close to campus, and seemed perfect at first. The house had its quirks. The wooden floors creaked with every step, the pipes groaned when you used the water, and there was a strange smell, faint but persistent, like damp earth. But the weirdest thing was the locked basement door. Josh was the first to ask about it. "What's in there?" he had said to the landlord, a wiry old man with a permanent scowl. The landlord's answer was curt. "Storage, off limits." Sarah had laughed it off. "Guess we don't have to worry about cleaning down there." But Megan wasn't so sure. Why lock it if it's just storage? Feels weird. Josh dismissed her concerns. "Who cares? We've got the rest of the house." The first few weeks passed without incident. They threw parties, stayed up late studying, and treated the place like any college rental. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was off. Sometimes, at night, she swore she could hear faint sounds coming from the basement, soft shuffling, like footsteps, or the occasional thud. "You're just imagining things," Josh said when she brought it up. "Maybe it's rats," Megan suggested. But Sarah wasn't convinced. One night she pressed her ear to the basement door, holding her breath. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, just as she was about to pull away, she heard it. A soft, low whisper. Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding. She told herself it was the wind, maybe an old pipe settling. But deep down, she didn't believe it. The next day, she convinced Josh to check it out. "We can't," he said. "The door's locked." "So?" Sarah handed him a butter knife. "Pick it." Josh grinned, always up for a challenge. Within minutes the lock clicked and the door creaked open. A foul, musty smell wafted out, making them gag. "Jesus," Josh muttered, shining a flashlight down the stairs. The basement was pitch black, the air heavy and damp. "Don't go down there," Megan said, appearing behind them. Josh rolled his eyes. "Relax, it's just a basement." He started down the steps, the flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him. Sarah hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She followed, Megan reluctantly trailing behind. The basement was bigger than they'd expected, with a dirt floor and walls lined with old shelves. Most were empty, but a few held dusty jars filled with what looked like bones, small ones, too small to be animal bones. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, but Josh was already moving toward a door at the far end of the basement. "This wasn't on the floor plan," he said, grinning like a kid on a treasure hunt. "Josh, don't," Megan snapped. "Relax," he said, pushing the door open. The room beyond was small and windowless, with a single chair in the center. The chair was old, wooden, and stained dark with something that looked alarmingly like dried blood. On the walls were deep scratch marks, as if someone, or something, had been clawing to get out. Megan bolted upstairs, muttering, "This is too much." But Sarah stayed, her eyes fixed on the chair. Something about it made her skin crawl. "We should leave," she said to Josh. "Leave? Are you kidding? This is insane." He waved the flashlight around, revealing more scratches on the walls, strange symbols carved into the doorframe. "Josh, I'm serious," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. He sighed and followed her back upstairs, but she could tell he was annoyed. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept hearing things, the creak of footsteps, the soft whisper she'd heard before. Around 3 a.m., she got up to get some water and froze. The basement door was wide open. Her stomach turned. She was certain they'd locked it after coming back upstairs. Slowly she approached the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Josh," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. "Josh, this isn't funny." A faint creak echoed from below, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. She slammed the door shut and locked it, then ran back to her room. The next morning, Megan refused to stay in the house. "I don't care if I lose my deposit. Something's wrong with this place." Josh, however, wasn't convinced. "You guys are overreacting. It's an old house. It makes noises." But that night, he changed his tune. Sarah woke to a blood-curdling scream. She bolted out of bed, her heart racing, and ran to Josh's room. The door was open, the light flickering. Josh was sitting on the floor, his face pale, his hands trembling. "What happened?" Sarah asked. He pointed to his bed. "There was someone standing there, just staring at me. I thought it was you, but it wasn't. Then they were gone." Sarah helped him up, her own fear mounting. "We need to leave, now." The three of them packed what they could and left that night, driving to Megan's parents' house 2 towns over. The next day, they called the landlord to demand an explanation. At first, he was dismissive, but when Sarah mentioned the basement, he went silent. "You opened it, didn't you?" he finally said. "What's in there?" Sarah demanded. He sighed. "Look, I didn't want to scare you. The house has history. A man used to live there decades ago. He wasn't right. Took people down there. Did things to them." Sarah's stomach turned. "Why didn't you tell us?" "I didn't think you'd stay if I did." They hung up, shaken and furious. None of them ever returned to the house, but for weeks afterward, Sarah had nightmares about the basement. And sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear whispers coming from the shadows of her own room. It was the summer of 1985 when Jenna and her boyfriend, Luke, decided to spend a weekend at a remote cabin in the Smoky Mountains. They had been dating for just over a year, and this trip was supposed to be their escape from the monotony of city life. The cabin belonged to Luke's uncle, who rarely used it anymore, but it was rustic, charming, and isolated, just what they needed. The drive up was uneventful, though the winding roads and thickening fog made Jenna feel uneasy. "Are you sure this place has electricity?" she joked, trying to lighten the mood. Luke laughed. "Don't worry. It's got power, running water, and a killer view. You'll love it." By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The trees cast long shadows, and the air was cooler than they'd expected. The cabin looked worn but sturdy, with a wraparound porch and a single light glowing in the living room window. Luke assured Jenna it was just an automatic timer his uncle had set. Inside, the place smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew. The walls were lined with hunting trophies and faded photos, and the furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust. Despite its quirks, Jenna thought the place had character. They unpacked, made dinner, and settled into the couch with a bottle of wine. Outside, a storm was brewing, the wind howling through the trees. "Perfect spooky vibes," Jenna teased as she leaned into Luke. But the laughter faded when the first loud knock echoed through the cabin. Luke froze, his hand tightening around the wine glass. "Did you hear that?" Jenna whispered. Another knock came, this time louder. It wasn't the kind of sound wind could make. It was deliberate, human. Luke got up, grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen counter. "Probably just a hiker," he said, though his voice wavered. Jenna followed him to the door, her heart pounding. When they opened it, no one was there. The porch was empty, and the only sound was the storm picking up strength. Luke shone the flashlight into the woods, but the beam didn't reveal anything unusual. "Probably kids messing around," he muttered, closing the door. but Jenna wasn't so sure. They locked the door and tried to shrug it off, but as the night wore on, the storm worsened, and the cabin seemed to grow colder. The old windows rattled, and the wind seemed to carry whispers, faint and unintelligible, but persistent. Jenna felt a knot of unease in her stomach. "I don't like this, Luke," she said. "It's just the storm," he reassured her. "Let's get some sleep." They went to bed, but Jenna couldn't relax. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the relentless wind. Around 2 a.m., she heard it again, a knock. Not at the front door this time, but at the back of the cabin. "Luke," she hissed, shaking him awake. He groaned. "What now?" "There's someone outside." Luke grabbed the flashlight and climbed out of bed. Jenna followed, staying close behind him. They crept toward the back door, and Luke shone the beam through the small window. Nothing. He opened the door slightly, peering out into the storm. The wind whipped the rain into his face, but the flashlight revealed nothing but trees and mud. As he turned to close the door, Jenna gasped. "What?" he asked, alarmed. She pointed to the ground. There, in the mud, were footprints, barefoot, large and fresh. "Who the hell walks around barefoot in a storm?" Luke muttered. Jenna tugged his arm. "Let's just leave. We can drive back to town and come back in the morning." But Luke shook his head. "It's probably just some drunk camper. We'll be fine." Jenna didn't argue, but she didn't feel fine. Back in bed, Jenna couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. She lay awake, straining to hear anything over the storm. Hours passed, and just as she was starting to drift off, she heard it. A creak, faint but unmistakable, coming from the living room. "Luke," she whispered, shaking him awake again. He groaned, annoyed. "What now?" "Someone's inside." He sat up, listening. Another creak, louder this time. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the flashlight and a kitchen knife. "Don't go," Jenna begged, but he was already moving. She stayed in the bedroom, clutching the blankets tightly, her ears straining for any sound. Luke called out, "Hello? Who's there?" Silence. Then a loud crash. Jenna screamed as Luke yelled her name. She bolted out of bed and ran into the living room, where she found him standing near the fireplace, the flashlight on the floor. "What happened?" she asked, breathless. Luke pointed to the wall. A large, jagged hole had been punched through the wooden paneling. "What the hell could have done that?" Jenna whispered. "I don't know," Luke said, his face pale. They didn't wait to find out. Grabbing their keys, they fled the cabin, running through the rain to the car. The drive down the mountain was harrowing. The storm had washed out parts of the road, and the fog was so thick Luke could barely see. As they rounded a bend, Jenna glanced into the side mirror and froze. "Luke, stop the car," she whispered. "What?" "Just stop." He hit the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. Jenna turned around, staring out the rear windshield. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and completely still. "Drive," Jenna said, her voice trembling. Luke didn't argue. He hit the gas, and the car roared down the mountain, the figure vanishing into the fog. They didn't stop until they reached a small diner miles away. Inside, they sat in silence, trying to process what had happened. Later, they learned that the cabin had a dark history. Luke's uncle had bought it from a man whose brother had gone missing there years earlier. Locals told stories about strange sightings in the woods, about hikers who never came back. Luke and Jenna never returned to the cabin. And sometimes late at night, Jenna still dreams of that figure standing in the road, watching them leave.